What if one morning you woke up in the ruins of a mighty empire and no one remembered how or why it fell? Imagine walking through shattered marble columns, past broken aqueducts that once carried fresh water to millions, and seeing children play among them, unaware they were ever more than just strange old rocks. In the year 476 AD, the last Roman emperor in the West, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was quietly overthrown. No wars, no flames, no heroic resistance, just silence. This is not the tale of Rome's glory. This is the story of what came after, a time of crumbling greatness, forgotten knowledge, and quiet despair. A city once called eternal, now barely alive. But hidden in the ashes were sparks of memory, of faith, of survival. In the next 25 minutes, we'll walk those empty streets, meet the warlords who ruled by fear, the priests who whispered hope, and the forgotten citizens who lived between shadows and superstition. This is the Rome after Rome. And it's a story no one ever told you until now, Romulus Augustulus. Barely 14 years old, a mere stripling yet burdened with a name that resonated with the very genesis of Rome, Romulus, the mythical founder. And then the cruel irony of Augustulus, a diminutive, almost mocking echo of Augustus, the empire's greatest architect. Two names, once pillars of unparalleled power and ambition, now serving as the epitaph for an empire teetering on the brink of oblivion. This wasn't a grand, heroic figure, no, but a bewildered child thrust into a world already unraveling at its seams. In that fateful year, 476 AD, within the fading, echoing corridors of Ravenna, the last bastion of imperial authority, Romulus found himself facing not a barbarian horde, but a pragmatic Germanic military leader named Odoacer. Odoacer, a man weary of the ceaseless parade of puppet emperors and broken promises, demanded more than allegiance. He demanded an end. There was no epic last stand, no loyal legions to defend the young emperor's honor, no climactic battle etched into the annals of time. Instead, it was a quiet, almost dismissive abdication. Romulus, the last Western Roman emperor, surrendered his crown with little fanfare, granted a small pension, and sent into an ignominious exile. The Western Roman Empire, after centuries of unparalleled glory, did not end with a roar, but with a whimper, fading not in a blaze of glory, but with an almost unbearable indifference. Some historians, and I count myself among them, argue that the most tragic fall is not one marked by bloodshed and fire, but one that concludes in silence, leaving behind only the echoing emptiness of what once was. And yet there's a cruel poetry to this quiet demise, isn't there? Rome began with a Romulus, and Rome ended with a Romulus. A cyclical tragedy, a mirror reflecting the empire's beginning and its end. It is precisely here, in this quiet, bureaucratic surrender, in the mundane act of a boy giving up a crown, that the long, dark night of the Middle Ages truly began. It wasn't on some blood-soaked battlefield, but in the almost casual surrender of a title that the imperial sun finally set. And from the ashes of this young emperor's lost empire, the true story of post-imperial Rome would begin to unfold. A narrative not of triumphal arches and conquering legions, but of slow, creeping decay, of fading memories, and ultimately of profound, almost complete forgetting. The stage is set, my friends, for a journey into the shadows, a descent into the quiet dissolution of an empire, and a glimpse into the forces that would reshape the very fabric of Western civilization. What indeed became of Rome when Rome itself ceased to be? Let's follow that path of decay and discover the truth. In the annals of history, empires often fall not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not always amidst the clash of steel and the cries of the dying, but sometimes in the insidious creep of silence, in the tendrils of forgotten dreams, and in the relentless march of time. Such was the fate of Rome, a colossal power that after centuries of dominion didn't explode in a cataclysm, but simply profoundly crumbled. Imagine, if you will, the grand forums of Rome, once the vibrant heart of an empire, now echoing with emptiness. The very air that once buzzed with the fervent debates of senators, the bustling chatter of merchants, and the authoritative pronouncements of law now hung heavy with an eerie stillness. The magnificent mosaic floors, which once shimmered under the Mediterranean sun, became desolate landscapes, playgrounds for scurrying rats and gathering shadows. A profound desolation settled upon the city, a testament to a glory that had slipped away like sand through an hourglass. The lifeblood of Rome, its intricate network of aqueducts, once a marvel of engineering, began to fail. Without the constant vigilance of skilled hands, the flow of fresh water, vital to the city's very existence, dwindled and then vanished. The fountains, once a joyous symphony of splashing water, fell silent. The opulent public baths, vibrant centers of social life and hygiene, turned cold and desolate, their once steaming air now thick with the scent of dust and decay. It was a slow strangulation, a drying up of the very essence that had sustained a bustling metropolis. Yet survival, in its rawest form, knows no sentiment, no reverence for past grandeur. As desperation gnawed at their souls, the citizens, those who remained, began to dismantle the very foundations of their heritage. The stones that had once formed the majestic temples and grand theaters were now pried apart, not by invaders, but by the very hands that once cheered in their glory. Marble columns, symbols of enduring strength and artistic mastery, were ruthlessly burned to create lime for crude makeshift shelters. Gold leaf, stripped from ancient ceilings that once gleamed with imperial splendor, was bartered for the meager sustenance of bread. The Colosseum, that colossal amphitheater where gladiators once fought and emperors held sway, became a quarry. The same hands that had once celebrated the spectacle of combat now tore away stone by stone, not for construction or progress, but for the stark necessity of fuel to ward off the encroaching chill of a fallen world. It was a heartbreaking metamorphosis, a grand monument reduced to a source of survival, each removed stone a chisel stroke in the dismantling of a legacy. And in the silent ruins, amidst the shattered remnants of an empire, children played. Their laughter, innocent and untainted by the weight of history, echoed through the skeletal remains of forgotten wonders. Slowly, inevitably, they stopped asking who had built these magnificent structures. The knowledge, once a shared inheritance, simply faded from memory. The sword, the instrument of Rome's initial rise and fearsome power, had at last fallen silent. In its place, however, emerged a different tool. The chisel, wielded not to create but to destroy, to dismantle, to scavenge. Rome was no longer the pulsating heart of a vast empire. It was a ghost, a hollowed-out echo of its former self, wearing its own bones as a mournful shroud. What more can we uncover about this silent collapse, this slow descent into oblivion? How did a civilization, once so mighty, surrender to the inexorable forces of decay and forgetfulness? The story of Rome's crumbling is not just a tale of destruction, but of the enduring human spirit in the face of insurmountable loss and the quiet erasure of memory. But what became of the people who survived this transformation, and what whispers of their lives remain in the silent stones? Imagine, if you will, a world where the very essence of knowledge, once meticulously cultivated and grandly displayed, simply dissolved into the air. Not through conquest or fire, but through a far more insidious enemy, forgetfulness. This was the stark reality that descended upon Rome after its colossal empire faltered. It was a twilight of the mind, where the intricate tapestry of human achievement began to unravel, thread by painstaking thread. In a mere 2 or 3 generations, a blink in the eye of history, the very people who inherited the grandeur of Rome found themselves adrift in a sea of ignorance. The profound engineering prowess that had enabled their ancestors to construct aqueducts spanning vast mountain ranges, to lay down roads that stretched to the far corners of their sprawling empire, and to build luxurious baths that cleansed both body and spirit, vanished from collective memory. It wasn't a sudden, violent erasure, but a quiet, creeping amnesia. The engineers, the masterminds of hydraulic systems and architectural wonders were gone. The doctors, once adept at healing and understanding the human form, followed suit. The precious scrolls they left behind, brimming with millennia of accumulated wisdom, either rotted in damp, neglected libraries or were cruelly consumed by fires, ignited by hands that had lost the ability to decipher the very symbols that held such profound secrets. It's a haunting thought, the legacy of genius reduced to ashes by those who couldn't comprehend its worth. Children, once destined to inherit the esteemed professions of their forefathers, the precision of the architect, the empathy of the healer, now found themselves scavengers, their days consumed by the primal quest for firewood. They no longer learned the delicate art of suturing wounds or the complex calculations for measuring water flow. Their education was stripped to its bare essentials. The harsh, immediate lessons of how to survive another sun-drenched day in a crumbling world. The legal codes, once meticulously carved in stone and upheld by the unwavering hand of magistrates, lay undisturbed in dust-covered codices that no one dared to open, much less understood. Law, the very framework of Roman society, gave way to raw instinct. Philosophy, the pursuit of wisdom and truth, was supplanted by the gnawing anxieties of fear. The intellectual light, once burning so brightly, flickered and threatened to extinguish. And with this loss, the world itself seemed to shrink. Rome, which had once charted and dominated the shape of the known world, now barely held onto the fragmented memories of its own illustrious past. Its citizens no longer gazed with ambition at the distant stars or debated the grand policies of the Senate. Instead, their gaze was drawn inexorably to the earth beneath their feet, their fundamental question shifting from a visionary "what can we build?" to a desperate "what can we salvage?" It wasn't the fury of a barbarian horde or a devastating blaze that ultimately annihilated Roman knowledge. It was the relentless, silent march of time, aided by the profound, echoing silence of a civilization that had forgotten how to listen to its own history. In the desolate ruins of a once mighty empire, the very mind of a civilization dimmed, not through the brutal force of war, but because tragically, catastrophically, there was no one left to light the lamps of learning. What further depths of forgetting did they plumb, and could any flicker of that ancient light ever be rekindled? When the grand edifices of power collapse, authority doesn't simply vanish into thin air. It finds new, often brutal forms. In the desolate landscape of post-imperial Rome, the familiar pillars of governance, emperors, senatorial decrees, and legions were no more. Yet the city still teemed with streets, markets, and most importantly, people. And wherever humanity gathers, the relentless impulse to control, to dominate, invariably surfaces. The disciplined ranks of the Praetorian Guard and the ingrained sense of civic duty that once bound Roman society had dissolved into the winds of change. In their stead, a new breed of authority emerged: hardened men. These were not noble figures born of lineage or law, but survivors forged in the crucible of chaos, former bandits, ruthless mercenaries, or forgotten centurions whose loyalty now extended only to themselves. They began to carve up the once magnificent city like a fresh kill, each claiming their own bloody dominion. One such figure might have seized the strategic prominence of the Aventine Hill, transforming its ancient slopes into a personal stronghold. Another, perhaps, took refuge within the crumbling sanctity of a former temple of Jupiter, twisting reverence into a tool of intimidation. A third, with a chilling pragmatism, imposed a toll on anyone daring to cross the ancient stone bridge on the Tiber, turning a vital artery of the city into a choke point for personal gain. These were not leaders in any traditional sense. They were survivors with swords, and in a world devoid of order, they became the undisputed kings of their own grim shadows. Rome was no longer governed, it was gripped. The very air thrummed with a tangible tension, a constant undercurrent of fear. The citizens, caught in this cruel maelstrom of anarchy, quickly internalized a brutal truth: Loyalty, however coerced, could buy safety. At least for a fleeting moment. A desperate merchant might pledge fealty to the local warlord, hoping for the meager assurance that his goods would be spared from plunder. A grieving widow might offer her last loaf of bread, her silent prayer that her humble home would remain untouched through the long, terrifying night. Justice, once dispensed through the majestic pronouncements of scrolls and the solemn dignity of courtrooms, now manifested with chilling immediacy at the edge of a blade. Disputes were settled not by reasoned argument or legal precedent, but by brute force and swift, often summary violence. And while their names would never be etched in the hallowed stones alongside Caesar or Augustus, these self-proclaimed warlords exerted a power that was far more intimate, more immediate, and often far more brutal than any emperor had ever wielded. Rome had not vanished into the mists of time, it had merely mutated. The eternal city, though scarred and broken, was still breathing. But it was now breathing through clenched teeth, a testament to an enduring spirit trapped in a new, terrifying reality. What dark pacts were forged in these shadows, and how long could a city endure such a strained, agonizing breath? As dusk draped its heavy cloak over the broken city, the very ruins whispered. Columns, snapped by the relentless march of time, stood like gaunt sentinels against a bruised sky. Statues, their faces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, stared blankly into the encroaching darkness. And as the fragile tendrils of memory began to fray and vanish, a more primal, potent force seeped into the void: fear. The inhabitants of this haunted Rome no longer saw their ancient city as a testament to unparalleled glory or a monument to human ingenuity. Instead, it had become a haunted landscape, a place where the echoes of a distant, incomprehensible past mingled with the chilling anxieties of the present. They swore that specters of senators still lingered in the forums where grand debates once raged. The very air around the Colosseum after dusk was said to carry the phantom screams of gladiators, forever locked in their final, brutal dance. What was once magnificent architecture slowly, inexorably, transmuted into myth. The abandoned temples of Jupiter and Mars, once vibrant centers of worship, were now whispered to house restless spirits, their sanctity twisted into something sinister. Fountains, dry for decades, their ornate basins choked with dust and debris, became the rumored hiding places of malevolent demons. Children were sternly warned to keep their distance from crumbling archways, lest their innocent games inadvertently awaken something ancient and terrible that slumbered within the stones. Even the surviving scrolls, once repositories of profound philosophy, life-saving medicine, and groundbreaking engineering, were regarded with deepening suspicion. To the illiterate and the terrified, the elegant curves of Latin letters no longer conveyed knowledge. They appeared as cryptic, potent spells. The very wisdom of Rome, once a beacon of enlightenment, now resembled dangerous witchcraft. While the burgeoning in the absence of emperors, someone had to lead. And in Rome's darkest hour, that someone wore no crown, commanded no army, only faith. The Bishop of Rome, later known as the Pope, stepped quietly into a power vacuum left by centuries of imperial rule. Not by ambition, but by necessity. People were starving, raiders threatened the gates, order had collapsed. And while warlords offered weapons, the Church offered something deeper: hope. Years before, Pope Leo the Great had met Attila the Hun outside the city walls, convincing the scourge of God to turn away without a single sword drawn. That moment was no miracle. It was diplomacy rooted in wisdom, courage, and timing. After the fall, this spiritual authority became a practical one. The Pope organized food distributions. He negotiated with barbarians. He became the voice in empty forums, the shepherd in a city of sheep and wolves alike. Without legions he protected, without taxes he built, without laws he inspired. But his power was fragile. The Pope had to bow to warlords to trade treasures of the Church for peace. He had to walk the thin line between servant and savior, constantly balancing between spiritual integrity and political survival. Yet slowly, something remarkable happened. While emperors were forgotten, the papacy endured. As ruins multiplied, the church became Rome's last standing pillar, not of stone but of purpose. In time, the pope would become more than a bishop. He would become the moral compass of a crumbling world, the new Caesar not of conquest but of conscience. What does it mean to be Roman when Rome itself forgets? For centuries, to be Roman was to belong to something vast, an empire, a culture, a law, a language. It meant citizenship, pride, power. But after the fall, those meanings began to slip away. Children born among the ruins grew up playing in the shadows of triumphal arches, unaware they once celebrated world-conquering legions. They saw Latin inscriptions carved into crumbling stone, but couldn't read them. Names like Julius Caesar and Marcus Aurelius became stories, then rumors, then ghosts. Some thought the great buildings had been made by giants. Others believed they were the work of gods. No one remembered that ordinary Romans, engineers, artists, visionaries had built them. The empire had not just lost its armies. It had lost its memory, and with memory goes identity. In time, people no longer called themselves Romans. They became simply locals. Their pride was no longer in law or legacy, but in survival. Their heroes were no longer emperors, but strongmen who protected a few streets. Even the language began to fade. Classical Latin gave way to dialects, then to proto-languages that would one day become Italian, French, Spanish. But they were no longer Roman tongues. Rome had not been conquered from without, it had evaporated from within. And that is perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. Not that a city was lost, but that its people no longer knew they had once ruled the world. Among the ruins, life went on, but it was no longer glorious. The average Roman no longer lounged in marble baths or cheered in packed amphitheaters. They scraped by, clutching what little they had, haunted by greatness they could no longer touch. Their world shrank to the alley, the field, the fire they could keep lit through the night. Once bread and circus were the emperor's promise. Now there was no bread and certainly no circus. Entertainment was replaced by silence. The only games were those of power and fear. Bandits roamed freely. Disease flourished in the filth. Water was scarce, food scarcer. People bartered, begged, or bowed to survive. Night brought its own terrors. With no guards, no laws, people blocked their doors with rocks and prayers. The city of light had become a maze of shadows. And yet they endured. Mothers still sang lullabies. Farmers still coaxed life from tired soil. Candles still flickered in hidden chapels. Against all odds, the human spirit refused to yield. They did not live like Romans, they lived like survivors. And perhaps that's what saved them. Because somewhere beneath the dust and despair, a flicker of civilization still smoldered, waiting for air, for light, for time, waiting for a second chance. History rarely ends, it lingers. And in the shattered heart of Rome, something small began to stir. In remote monasteries, monks lit candles over fading texts and copied them by hand, preserving words no one else could read. In crumbling chapels, sermons offered more than salvation, they offered structure. And amid the noise of warlords and whispers of spirits, whispers of rebirth began. Trade routes once abandoned reopened slowly. Grain moved, ideas moved. Hope moved, but the true spark came from beyond, from the east. As Muslim forces pressed into once Christian lands and the Byzantine Empire cried for aid, something ancient reawakened. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in Clermont and called for a crusade, not just a war but a mission. A mission to